This was absurd. I could not believe another corpse was gone. I went to check up on newly arrived dead bodies, and when I reached there were only 6 of them, while I was informed that 7 dead bodies were brought up from an accident site. It was the 4th one this month that got missing from the hospital morgue, and I couldn't believe even more that they were not raising the security. I mean, yes, I understand that these people were already dead, but if the corpses are getting stolen, then the least they could do is raise security. Anyways, after confirming that there were 7 bodies brought in, I went directly to the mortician who was in charge of the morgue, Jeremy Henry. People mostly called him Henry, and he was the nicest, kindest person I'd ever met. Okay, so I was telling you that I went to him, and I told him about another corpse being missing. He looked concerned as I told him this and said, "This is going to damage the reputation of our hospital. Do we know the identity of the body?" "No. Do you realize that the only bodies that ever go missing every single time are the ones that have 2 things in common? They freshly died and they are unidentified," I told him, and then he nodded his head. One thing that I was sure of is that I haven't even mentioned in front of Henry, and that was that the culprit was someone who was working in the hospital. There was another thing that I was sure of, which was that Henry was also suspecting it, and that it must be someone in a higher position, or at least someone who knew everything related to the dead bodies and the morgue. I went back to the morgue after the autopsies of the 6 dead bodies that were done and cleaned up in place. The only thing on my mind was curiosity about those missing bodies, and it wasn't like they got up and walked down on their own. I could do it. I could also act as if nothing had happened and ignore the fact that someone was stealing bodies from the morgue. But I felt like it was disrespecting towards the dead, so I decided to start looking out for anyone who seemed suspicious. 2 days passed, and it was a day when the director of the hospital was to arrive to ask the employees if they were facing any issues and then address them. It was the perfect opportunity to bring this matter to light, so when he asked us if we were facing any sort of issue, I raised my hand. He told me to speak freely about whatever was on my mind, and so I started telling him about the missing bodies from the morgue. Even though he told me the mortician took care of it, I could see him furrowing his eyebrows, which felt a little odd to me. But again, not many hospitals care about dead bodies. I've seen such morgues who don't even treat the bodies nicely. The next day, another dead body of a guy was brought in. The boy was said to have hung himself and committed suicide. He was an orphan, so the hospital was instructed to arrange the burial of the body by itself. Something in me was saying that this corpse would also get stolen, so I decided to guard it by not leaving the morgue no matter what. As I was trying to guard the morgue, hours had passed, and I had taken a single break, so I started feeling tired and sleepy. I did not know when I dozed off, but as I was dozing off, I heard footsteps, so I slightly opened my eyes, half asleep, only to see that it was Henry. He was with another male nurse. He looked in my direction, and I pretended to be asleep. As I closed my eyes, I could hear footsteps and noises. I could tell that they were trying to be sneaky, and that they would have been successful if I was asleep. But I wasn't, and I could hear everything. I opened my eyes 5 minutes after I felt complete silence, and immediately went back to check the cabin in which the boy's body was put. It was exactly what I had expected. The body was gone, and the person I trusted the most, thinking that he would never do such a thing, was the culprit behind all this. Still, I decided to go along with the act and ran to this cabin looking all worried, and told him that the body was missing. His concerned act was pretty convincing if I didn't know any better. I looked at him in a daze as he was asking, but then all of a sudden, he stopped playing the act and looked at me with a very serious look, as if he was trying to figure something out. He told me to go to the morgue, and then that he'll be there in a few minutes, so I walked out of his office. After a few steps, I decided to turn back around and check again because I didn't understand his reaction from earlier. So I walked back to him and sneakily hid behind the door as he seemed to be on a phone call with someone. "Yes, I sent the body. About the girl? I think she's onto something. Yes, I know that you told me to take care of her that day, but I was just giving her another chance. No, don't worry anymore. I'll take care of her tonight when there would be no one around." As I was listening to this conversation, my heart started to drop. I could tell that he was talking about killing me tonight, so I decided to get away from this hospital as fast as I could. I decided to run towards my cabin and grab my stuff, and after that I sneaked around to see if anyone was there. When I noticed that the path was clear, I quietly walked out of the hospital. At first I decided to go to the police directly, but then I remembered that I did not have any proof against them. So I called the cab and headed to my apartment. And as I was looking out from the window of the cab, I couldn't stop to think about Jeremiah Henry. He looked so nice and sweet and acted all kind, but he was just a snake wearing an angel's skin to fool the people around him.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
You know that there aren't many people who are willing to take a job at a morgue, and that must be the reason that they pay such a good amount of money. But looking at it, I guess the money is still very less compared to the life-threatening experience that one can have in there. My name is Colin Thompson, and I'm currently 28 years old and working at a school as a security head. I got this job 2 months ago, and even though the pay is not as good, this one still is far better in comparison to the last one with the good money. It was about 6 months ago when I was searching for a job desperately, and that was when I came across this ad about a job at a morgue. It was for security, and the pay was $50 an hour. I mean, it was good pay if I were to get this job. So I thought of going in there for an interview and called the number that was given there. They told me to come the next day for an interview at the address given in the advertisement, exactly at 11 in the morning, and then hung up the call. The next day I met a lady for the interview. She must be around the age of 40 or 45. She asked me about my experience related to the security field, which I had for just 2 years at the time, and if I could work during the nighttime or not. I did not want to lose this opportunity to earn some good money, so I agreed to do whatever she said. She also asked me if I were to work more than 8 hours any day, and I'll get an extra $20 apart from the hourly salary. And apart from that, meals would also be provided by them. I could not believe my luck to be this good. Not only was I getting a job that was paying well, but also such great perks. Lastly, they told me that I could join the next day, and then asked me to go. The next day, I was there on time. I know working at a morgue might sound a little bit creepy, which for me it was too, but it wasn't like there wasn't any harm in it. So I started my first day of work, which was going pretty well, and I decided to work past 8 hours just to get the extra $20. As I was working, I heard some weird noises coming from inside the morgue, so I decided to go check. I quickly and quietly walked inside. When I reached one of the rooms where dead bodies were stored, I noticed the noise was coming from there. So I walked in to see one of the dead bodies outside the morgue refrigerator, which was pulled aside. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared, which I was, but I still pushed it back and then locked the door from the cabin which the dead body was in. After making sure the door was locked, I left the room as soon as I could. My 8-hour shift had already ended and I was only there to spend another hour or so. So I decided as soon as the hour ends, I would leave after informing the person in charge. After about 15 minutes had passed, I again heard the same noises as before coming from inside. I did not want to go inside to check again, but since it was my job to do so, I had to go in there. As I walked in, I again stopped in front of the same room as earlier, and the noise was coming from in there for sure. I hesitantly and trembling walked in there, only to find the same dead body in the same condition as before. Trust me, I was scared as hell, even more than before. But I still pushed the body back in and locked the door once again. I almost ran back to my seat and immediately dialed the lady's number. She picked up after the 3 rings. I told her that I would be leaving, and surprisingly, she did not ask me to complete the hour, not even once. I ran back to my apartment in a cold sweat, and I was shaking my feet from the horrified feeling that I was having. There was no way that I left the door unlocked to the cabin, because I was sure to recheck it before leaving, and what were those noises that I heard which stopped the second that I walked into the room? All of these thoughts surrounded my mind, which kept me awake the entire night. Even though I did not want to go the next day, I still did it, and I went to work. All night, I was just thinking, and it made me come to the conclusion that there was a possibility that the lock of the particular cabin may not be working, which caused the corpse to come out of its own. So I started working, and it was a relief that everything was quiet the entire time. My shift was about to end, and I decided not to stay another hour like last night. But as there were only 50 minutes left for my shift to end, I again heard a loud thud sound coming from inside. Without even realizing, my legs felt heavy and started trembling as if they were asking me not to go in there. But I still had to go and check. So I walked in with silent footsteps and yet again stopped in front of the same room. After entering the room, I saw the same dead body, which was lying on the floor this time. My legs gave up after the sight and refused to walk closer to the corpse. That was when its head moved on its own and my eyes were met with the eyes of a corpse that was looking straight into them. It made my blood run cold and I ran out of there while screaming. Noises did not stop. Instead, it only got louder. While I was running back to my apartment, I dialed that woman's number and told her about everything that I just witnessed. She did not deny or protest against it, which made me think that she knew about the morgue being haunted. I told her that I would not be able to continue working there any further. Strangely enough, she called me the next day and asked me to meet in a restaurant. I was hesitant to meet her, but I still went there. As I reached the restaurant, I found her sitting in an empty corner of it, and there weren't many people around at the time as well. She handed me a check and said, "Your salary is already credited to your account, and here's some extra money for you not to reveal the word about the morgue to anyone. If you want, I can write you a recommendation letter for your next job." I looked at her in a daze for a minute, and then I looked at the check from her hand. Even though I accepted her money, I refused any help from her to get a job because I wanted to find one on my own, with no further haunted experience involved.
This happened on Halloween of 2019. My friends and I were feeling the spooky vibes of the month and wanted to do something fun and exciting to satisfy our thirst. Being the dumb college students that we were, we decided on exploring somewhere allegedly haunted in the hopes of seeing some genuine paranormal activity. Since we're from Illinois, the popular destination of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery immediately came to mind, and it was settled upon. Once the sun had set and night had fallen, we were to make our move, sneaking into the cemetery after it had closed to get the full experience without having to worry about any other visitors. I must admit, I always wanted to do something like this before, but I was genuinely afraid of what might be waiting for us in that cemetery so late at night. Stories always circulated around the various apparitions people had encountered before, the different sounds that chilled them to the bone, and so on. Anyway, all of this was festering inside of me well before we actually started driving over to the cemetery sometime in the evening. It was a pleasantly long drive, but I wasn't really in the mood to think about anything else except for the potential horrors that roam the cemetery for all eternity, or so they say. Couple in the fact that we were going to be trespassing in order to get through in the first place, and I was a nervous wreck. My friends were apparently doing a much better job at keeping their fears in check, though. For the sake of the story, I'll call them Logan, Paul, and Eddie. The entire car ride there, they were laughing and joking around, not worried about what we would be getting into or what we might see. Looking back at the whole situation, I should have known that their optimism was a bad sign. No way would we have been able to explore this place without them being the slightest bit nervous. But what's done is done. A little past 7, once night had finally fallen for real and darkness went on in every direction for as far as the eye could see, we arrived. Parking in the main parking lot was out of the question because we did some looking into it and found that in previous years, local law enforcement liked to wait there and catch any would-be explorers before they could even get inside, so we had a backup plan. Since the actual cemetery was located in the center of a dense forest on all sides, essentially forming a square where all the roads would go around it, we were to park at some restaurant that was open super late and had a huge parking lot, all the way in the back, furthest away from the restaurant itself and closest to the road. This was in the exact opposite direction from the front entrance of the cemetery, so we figured this was our best chance of getting in while avoiding any cops in our way. From there, we'd cross the street on foot and have a bit of a walk before arriving at a somewhat hidden path leading into the forest. Taking this back path would take a bit more to get to the actual cemetery itself, since there were trees particularly thick and dense, but it was well worth it when considering the alternative. After everything was said and done, we found ourselves beginning our trek onto the path, unsure of how far we'd actually have to go before we find what we were looking for. It was a windy night, and even though it wasn't especially cold or anything, I still remember my teeth chattering and my skin going cold. Aside from the occasional sounds of leaves being crunched under our shoes as we walked, there was absolute silence. My once cheerful and energetic friends were now, all of a sudden, quiet and subdued. Logan in particular had this odd expression on his face, it being illuminated by my phone's flashlight as we walked. It was some sort of cross between fear and pain, like every step he took was causing him physical harm. Before I could question him about it, we found ourselves at our destination. Here we were, in the heart of Bachelor's Grove, with graves all around us and a certain chill in the air. Everyone split up to cover more ground, promising to call the others over if they were to encounter something. I didn't want us going too far away from one another, but I also didn't want to seem like a complete baby, so I kept my mouth shut and began exploring. Most of the graves I looked at had withered away from time and the elements, so I couldn't really make out anything that was on the tombstones. The few dates that I could read went back to the late 1800s, and a sinking feeling in my stomach started once I realized these people had been dead and decaying in the ground for over 100 years. Feeling extremely uncomfortable with this realization, I began to back away from the graves and start to look for my friends to see if they had found anything supernatural. Yet when all of a sudden, I heard it. Not just me either. All of us did. It was a low, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention, but with the way our senses were heightened, there was no way we would miss it. It appeared to be some sort of chanting, and it sounded like it was coming a little bit north from our direction, further in a clearing. I couldn't make any of the words being spoken or if it was even in English, but there was something creepy about the tone, like it was religious and the chanting was some sort of prayer. The voice that was doing the chanting was deep and gravelly, belonging to some man that we couldn't see. The four of us shone our lights on each other to see our expressions, and at that moment, we knew what we were going to do. Despite every fiber in my being telling me not to go any further and see what the source of this chanting was, my curiosity got the better of me and I couldn't resist. Eddie whispered to us to turn our lights off completely, while he dimmed his just enough to where it wouldn't attract too much attention, but we would still be able to see with it. The next few moments we spent creeping towards the noise, the more and more I started to lose it. My breathing was uncontrollable, and it felt like my heart was beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was so afraid of what we would find, and yet I still had to know. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we had entered the clearing and were a mere few steps away from this chanting. Eddie shone his light in the direction ahead of us, and for just a brief moment, we saw a cloaked figure bent over something in the grass, still chanting in that unrecognizable language. The thing in the grass looked like some sort of circle with a mark in the center, and I swear to God, I wish I could tell you I'm lying about this, but when I realized what the symbol was, I felt like throwing up. There was no mistake. It was a pentagram, made of some strange material. For the moment that Eddie had illuminated the sight in front of us, I had been able to get a glimpse of the pentagram's material being bright red, and I shouldn't have to say any more about that. Once the light from Eddie's phone hit the back of the man's head, he immediately stopped chanting and stood up, still facing the direction of the pentagram. I can only describe the next few minutes as truly unadulterated terror. Before we knew it, he screamed a blood-curdling scream that rattled us to the core and turned around, beginning to sprint towards us. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't even make out the man's facial features except for deep sunken eyes and an expression that radiated pure hatred. He really did want to bring us harm, and not wasting any time, we all fled the direction we came from and ran faster than I think any of us had ever ran in our entire lives. I couldn't even scream while running. I was too petrified to make any noise. Maybe it was a miracle, but we somehow managed to retrace our steps all the way through the path we took to enter the cemetery and forest, and eventually came out the main road, which was devoid of any traffic for the time being. Afraid of what I would see if I looked back, I made a beeline for the car along with the others and hopped into the back seat, not wasting any time to lock the door and roll up the window. We peeled out of there in no time flat and didn't stop driving 20 over the speed limit until we were at least 10 minutes away. Honestly, I have no idea how far or how long that man chased us, but I do know this for sure. We weren't supposed to be there that night, and we must have been interrupting something important of his. I'll never know what it was, and honestly, I don't hope to ever find out. We never did talk about this experience again after that night, and we never went on another trip to somewhere abandoned or haunted ever again either. I think that fright we felt is enough to satisfy us for the rest of our lives, and I'm thankful beyond words that we all managed to get out together, alive. I live in a small rural community in the eastern United States. It's a nice little town, and because of my work in the medical field, I've met some interesting folks. I'm also familiar with law enforcement and emergency personnel. Small town life is not as dull and uneventful as people think, especially since everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I have a lot of stories to share, but since this one just happened, I'll start here. Because it's still very recent and the investigation is ongoing, I have to be vague with some details, but I needed to tell someone. I'm single and live alone. Due to a stalker, I've moved twice, but that's another story for another time. However, it is relevant for this story for multiple reasons. The first reason being that I have a dog for the sake of protection, as well as have motion sensors and outdoor security cameras. The second reason being the location of my home, which is literally down the street from the fire department. I can see it from my living room window right now, and a couple of blocks from the police station. However, next to the fire department is the road department, which is basically a parking lot where they park their road equipment and empty garage trucks at night and on weekends. Oddly, it doesn't have a security camera. Small town life, I suppose. My house sits on a hill with a good view of that side of the street. Due to the incline, the large trees in the front yard, and the half cornfield in the property next to me, most people in the street below wouldn't notice me in the backyard unless they were actively looking. However, I can see the street clearly. This incident happened Saturday evening. The county was holding its annual Independence Day spiel with a community barbecue, music, fireworks, etc. I didn't attend because it's just not my thing. Plus, I have a dog and the sound of fireworks could be traumatizing, as I'm sure many of you know. Before the big show, I took the dog out to relieve herself in the backyard. There was still at least an hour of daylight, but the entire neighborhood was pretty quiet because most everyone was at the fairgrounds or various other holiday events. So when an unfamiliar, large white pickup drove slowly down the street, I noticed. It must have turned around at the end of the street because I saw it again, moving in the opposite direction only about 20 seconds later. This time it turned into the parking lot of the road department. Now, people have been known to toss things into the empty garage trucks, usually at night to avoid getting caught, because they don't want to or they're unable to make the trip to the landfill themselves. Usually it's things like furniture or broken equipment, but I didn't see any of those things in the back of this truck. The driver was a somewhat stocky guy of average height. He took 3 large black trash bags from the bed of his truck and tossed them one by one into the hopper of the garbage truck. Then he left. Now, I swear I'm not one of those meddling rear window types who always thinks activity is suspicious and that their neighbors are up to no good, but something about this didn't sit right with me. Normally, when I see people tossing their garbage into the trucks and leaving, I don't bother reporting it because it's relatively harmless. But this time, I had a gut feeling. So I called the police. If anything, they could get the guy for illegally dumping trash from a barbecue or whatever. While I'm on the phone with dispatch, I put my dog inside to cut down on distractions while the officers investigate. A few minutes later, an officer arrived and I crossed the street to meet him, gave him a description of the events, and pointed out which of the trucks the man had tossed the bags. He found the bags, took photos. He put on gloves and told me to stay back. The bags were tied in a knot at the top, and it took him a minute to untie one because of the gloves and how tight the knot was. But eventually he got it open, looked inside for a few seconds, then twisted it closed and took a few steps back. "Dear God," he hissed under his breath. "What?" "It's a body." I felt sick. I could tell he felt sick too. I saw him grow pale. His hand was trembling when he held the radio. Even his voice was shaking as he gave the code to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded confused when she asked him to repeat it. Within 10 minutes, the county sheriff was on the scene. Even he looked sick at the contents of the bag. The coroner arrived about 10 minutes after that, and the first officer walked me back to the house along with another one who arrived at the same time as the coroner. Though I showed the first cop via the app on my phone when I described the events initially, I now showed them the video on a larger screen. The camera caught footage of the truck as it drove by both times, as well as pulling into the parking lot, though unfortunately not a clear view of the license plate or the man tossing the bags out of frame. We watched the footage over and over, pausing frames, the officers taking notes. Ultimately, they requested this footage as well as a copy of the files from the past week to see if the truck had been in the area before. I've also been saving footage until the road department installs their own camera this week. Because this is still fresh, I don't know many more details. I know the body was in pieces, as they said, but I don't know the age of the victim, the gender, cause of death, any of that. Information hasn't been released to the public yet. I don't know if the coroner has ever been able to identify the body yet. A police cruiser has been parked at the fire department next door for constant surveillance in case the guy comes back. The guy who dumped the body was likely a local. How else would he know that he could dump there? He probably thought it'd get buried in other people's illegal trash accumulated over the holiday weekend, and the sanitation crew wouldn't have bothered to investigate. When I think about how this guy lives in my community, it makes me physically ill. To think that he had clearly scouted the area for a dump site, that it may not have been the first time this had happened, that this could happen again. If I hadn't called it in, if I hadn't been in the backyard at the exact moment, or if I had ignored that gut feeling, the victim would have never been found, may never find potential justice. Their loved ones may never have closure. In fact, there's a possibility that it might just happen again to another poor soul, and I just hope that it's not me.